If what you do provokes, then so be it. If it provokes discourse, then it is good, for violence was avoided. If it provokes violence, then it is too good, for the violence was inevitable, and it is better for us to engage in it than to leave it for our children. Often I come across this logic that provocation is a bad thing. But how can that be true? They often argue it is because it could result in violence, and to them violence is clearly bad and should be avoided at all costs. But should it? What cost becomes too high a price to pay? Conflict avoidance is never touted by any normal person as some sort of permanent solution to our ever-existing life problems. We have the rational capacity to acknowledge that a conflict exists, and seeking out an end to these conflicts suddenly becomes taboo in our system, which we alienate provocateurs, and insomuch as we do so avoid conflict, inevitable conflict. Through the avoidance, we simply delay something that cannot be avoided. All we are really doing is passing these problems down to our descendants. It does not seem ethical to pass on problems down to our children if we are to hold ourselves as upstanding people. Conflict will exist and persist no matter what. It is a quality of the social being that is mankind. And there have only ever been two methods to resolve these issues. The act of provocation, which etymologically stems from the Latin to call out, to challenge, to bring forth, is a calling into human consciousness of a problem, an existing conflict that the provocateur is attempting to quite honestly resolve. That the proper resolution may differ from person to person, but the attempted action is clear, that there is something which needs attention that has been being wrongfully ignored. A conflict is requiring a conscious effort. The inevitability of this conflict is coming to pass. The ball, in a sense, is being passed to the provoked party, and from here they must decide on how to address the issue on their end. The first option, again, always remains continuation of avoidance, and most agree that this can only ever be a temporary solution, a proverbial sweeping under the rug. The second option, as painful as it may be, or at least seem, remains as discourse, the only peaceful option in which one can engage in order to resolve conflict. The final and most terminal method is violence. If we can agree that conflict resolution is preferable to conflict continuation, then we agree that conflict should be resolved. That leaves only two options. The one who provokes is one who initiates the resolution of the conflict, who brings it into mind. And this is unavoidably uncomfortable. However, despite some convincing rhetoric, this act of provocation is not in and of itself necessarily violent, nor a provocation to violence. Now, this may be contested by tyrant types, so I will address the issue now. The only way it could be said that the provocation necessarily leads to violence is to state that violence is the only possibility which can follow the provocation. That is to say that the one being provoked could only react with violence. We, however, know that this is not the only course of action that one who is provoked could take. They could instead choose to engage in discourse. In fact, the very indication that the provocation will inevitably bring out violence is an indictment of the provoked party to their part of the inevitable violence of their position in the conflict. That is to say, that to the provoked party, the violence is functionally inevitable. This also means that all the provocateur has done is bring to light the inevitability of violence, proving that the provoked party is aiming towards this method of conflict resolution. Now we can state that violence is not good. That is a fair possession to have, and perfectly reasonable. However, this becomes a different issue, because we are no longer criticizing provocation itself, but instead violence as a method of conflict resolution. All the provocateur can be justly blamed for is the enunciation of the existence of the conflict. The resolution of this conflict can be done through discourse, which is good and well and perfectly peaceful and graceful. If a provocation results in a peaceful discourse, however uncomfortable that may seem, then it is good and well. If a provocation leads to violence, and that means that the violence was an inevitability, and since it is better to take on challenges ourselves rather than pass those on to our children, assuming we value personal responsibility, then it is also good. There are, however, many people who actively deny that conflict exists, including the state. These people can be simply called deniers or denialists. Given that as humans we are each different, and as humans we exist in a finite world of scarcity, we will inevitably experience conflict. It would be logically incoherent to dismiss this existence of conflict, for we are in a constant state of it. In each and every human interaction or relationship, there necessarily exists some conflict. People who share values and principles will have less conflict between them, but there will always remain some conflict. If you also take into account people whom stem from completely different value systems with different ideas on ethics and morality, the conflict simply becomes more pronounced and noticeable. It is a straight lie to deny this as true, so the inevitability of conflict between value groups is indisputable. Conflict is unavoidable as a human being who acts within the world. From this we can ascertain that denialists are most likely incorrect, at least within a logical framework. The nihilists often use a different type of framework, however, to explain their ideas, which can be referred to as an ideology to explain the difference. I will give you an example of objective logic. 2 + 2 = 4. No one can interpret this subjectively in any other manner without being objectively incorrect. And the conclusion in the equation is self-evident. Now, mathematics is a form of pure objective logic, so on the scale of objectivity versus subjectivity, it would be 100% objective. In epistemology, or the way in which knowledge is attained, there is no sliding scale of subjectivity to objectivity. The goal of epistemology is to have our knowledge be as objectively true as possible. I'm going to go through an annoying set of examples just in order to get the point across. So please bear with me. Take for instance our knowledge of gravity and the dangers it poses for humans in falling from height. We, epistemologically, know that falling can result in injury, but the specific height which will result in an injurious fall varies from subject to subject. Falls from a certain height will injure any human maximally, which could be said to be very objectively true. However, as you lower the height, more people will survive the fall or be less prone to injuries than others. At a lower height, at some level, only half of people will suffer injuries, maximally injured death. Still further down, even fewer will be injured maximally or not. And at an even lower height, nearly every person will survive the impact. Most people would survive a fall of 10 feet, assuming they landed on their feet or went feet first. But some people would die from such a fall, depending on their age, health, or if they went head first. And it would also depend on what surface they landed on, soft pillows versus concrete. My point here is that depending on what you say, your statement can be more or less objective or subjective. If you were to say that an elderly lady suffering from osteoporosis shot from a cannon at 80 miles an hour into a brick wall would end up dead, that would be very, very close and within reason to an absolute objective statement. Likewise, if you said a healthy, athletic young man jumped from a height of 4 feet and landed on a gym mat would not be injured in any way, you would be very close to making another objective statement. If you alone change the subject, in either case to say a 2-week-old infant, the statements will shift. The point behind giving these examples is simply to show that there is a difference between subjectivity and objectivity. It is all too common for people to believe that subjective interpretations are objective. Many cannot tell the difference and sink into the solipsistic mindset that they alone are the correct party in a dispute. That is not to say that you should not fight for what you believe to be true, even though it is subjective, because the fight itself is an important part of epistemology. But it is very important that once all your avenues of logic have been extinguished to possess the capacity to step down from your pulpit and acquiesce to the more objective truth, it is important that you do not acquiesce until you are honestly convinced of your opponent's point. But you should not allow your ego to override your sense of reason. This is not an easy task, however, it is a delicate line you must walk if you want to seek out that which is true and avoid that which is not true. If one is willing to accept that conflict is an important aspect of human society in order to promote real progress in the human condition, we must not shy away from it. There are many who, however, wish to force this out from our conscious being, who wish us to avoid these issues for this or that reason. All of these reasons for avoidance, however, can be boiled down to one particular reason: power. For what is human progress to a petty tyrant? What does progress mean to the top of the hierarchy? It means more competition for their position at the top. As human society makes progress, that is to say, as one's unease is further and further reduced, the relative power difference between the top and the bottom begins to fade away. So the privileged positions on high lose out on their personal power. Logically, it is good for humanity to progress away from a state of uneasiness and into a state of greater ease. So there is all the incentive in the world to advocate for such ideas that would enable this ends. However, you can see by looking at the world today that this is not what happens. It is as though the ones in power are perfectly happy to undermine that which reduces human uneasiness, to punish those who are trying to make their lives better over time. Even the changes in the human condition are only allowed for cynically as a compromise for those in power to those at the bottom. Some will think my previous paragraph is in regards to the proletariat in conflict with the bourgeoisie, but that is not the case. On the contrary, this is a conflict between the state and the people, or more realistically, the bureaucracy and the people. Bureaucrats promise security yet bring none, all the while robbing you of your liberty as a consequence. They promise you reduced uneasiness, yet burden you all the same with taxes, fees, fines, and unsurmountable state coercion, all in the name of service. Just conceptualize the pathological nature of income taxation. On the one hand, the bureaucrats and politicians will tell you that it is a necessity for you to pay for the helpful services you need, and to do so they require funding. On the other hand, you sacrifice your own productivity, surrender your own market power, at least a portion thereof, for a service which normally is not influenced by market forces, meaning it is completely reliant on coercion and involuntary action. The way in which income taxes are collected and then spent by bureaucrats and politicians is detrimental and essentially unaccountable. It is unaccountable because there is no possibility of voluntary market coercion, and therefore no voluntary incentive to change, which means the only way in which change can be attained is via cynical motivations to attain power, which is essentially bribery or coercive non-voluntary enforcements, such as threats. The fact of bureaucratic bloat contained in the age-old proverb, "the bureaucracy is expanding to meet the needs of the expanding bureaucracy," exemplifies the unavoidable waste involved in the state machinery. Since this wastage is essentially unavoidable, it is important to keep as much wealth as possible out of the hands of the state bodies, bureaucrats. For every minute amount of wealth that goes into the hands of the state is that much a reduction in human progress. It is not my direct aim here, and not to prove it. It is, however, my point to show that the state has a direct interest in denying it is true. Denying the facts about it is its own pathology, for the sake of its continued power. It is undeniable that no one can spend your money better than you can, for no one possesses the knowledge of your needs better than yourself, and inasmuch as others may have the better talent, they lack the interest in your well-being, and so are not as proficient. There are, of course, marginal causes which point out the opposite, such as the infirm or mentally incapacitated. But what are they actually saying when they say this? The incapacitated are already lacking the capacity for self-care or self-interest. So the next best option is to have a person who is capable to take an interest in them. The state therefore acts in such a manner to make wards of us all. And in this case it is worse, for the incapacitated have a legitimate issue wherein self-care is an unavailable option, and so they therefore receive what could be called service. But when it comes to the state's treatment of people with full capacity for self-care, they mean to incapacitate all of us, even though we can already deal with ourselves. The effect in such a case is that of slavery, in some measure, however discreet, for doubly they are cynical, for they then charge us for the privilege of being their wards. Subversion here is not my goal, but instead the goal is to seek out and demolish used-up, pathetic rhetoric, and demonstrate logically how those who are denying the existence of conflicts are doing so cynically in order to maintain their power. The real subversion going on is the subversion of the voluntarism of the market and the empty ridicule given thereof by the corrupt, cynical, coercive, and power-craving state bureaucrats which wish to maintain their status quo. That being said, there are good, decent individuals, better and worse states and bureaucracies, but there is no such state or bureaucracy which lacks coercive structures capable of causing harm to all their people. The truth is that if you believe in and desire liberty, if you believe in and desire justice, and if you believe in and desire human progress, then you must awaken yourself to the truth of the antagonistic conflict between the conscious individual and the unconscious collective. The provocateur is the individual whom brings forth into conscious being the existence of a conflict to the minds of the unconscious collective, and as a light bringer will be denounced as a devil. But the truth is that the state is not God, and it is very good to remind it and everyone of that fact.